every parent owns a responsibility to teach their children the essential truths of the Christian faith. And every parent has a responsibility to show their children how to love and follow Jesus. And we all know that can only be done when God is at work in our hearts to initiate a relationship with Him, when He's the one who is empowering us to live for Him. And the best way to do that is on our knees. That's the most important posture a parent can take. Join me in my conversation with David Colonna as we talk about praying for our children. Part 1 of Praying for Our Children. Well, David, thanks so much for joining us on this Journey podcast. Man, we appreciate. I have been looking forward to our time together.
Oh, me too. I'm thrilled. Thank you so much, Ron, for the invitation.
You bet. So we're going to be talking about prayer, and we want to kind of drill down on praying for our children. So we want to think about parents and what prayer looks like, the challenges of prayer, and we want to look today at a passage that I heard you teach on, and I thought, man, that's really, really good. I'd like to use that to apply it to prayer. And it's from Daniel chapter 10. Now, we go a lot of places to find prayer passages. Daniel 10 is normally not the one I would first go to.
Yeah, that's fair. No, absolutely. You know, it's funny. Our church was doing a series on living counterculturally. And so we were doing a series focused on Daniel and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And so we were trying to ask the question, as you live in a culture that's, not your own, so to speak, what are some of the themes we can pull from those? And one of them was this idea of the prophets modeled prayer. And so this passage is such a fun place to look at Daniel's prayer life and to get this peek, kind of behind the curtain of what's going on when we pray.
Yeah, and I love that behind the curtain, and that's going to make sense as we work through this. It's going to be fun. We're just going to do a little Bible study as we go through this, and again, apply it right to parents and prayer. So let me set the context, and then you jump in and bring it right down to the book of Daniel. So Israel is this powerful kingdom, right? Under Solomon, Queen of Sheba comes and said, "Man, I've never seen anything like this," right? I love the passage where it says that silver was as plentiful as stones on the ground. But then sin always messes things up, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Solomon comes, you got a divided kingdom, you got Israel in the north, you got Judah in the south. The Assyrians come in, take the northern kingdom captive in 722 BC, and then in 586, the Babylonians come in and take the southern kingdom where the temple is, so that's very significant. So they don't kill all the Jews, they take them into captivity, and so you have the Jews scattered throughout the world. Now a lot of them are in Babylon, and then in 539, you have the Persians taking over. It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. You just see these different empires throughout history. As I was studying a little bit for actually another sermon, they said that the Babylonian fall to Persia was so easy. One of the quickest takeovers of any other empire. In fact, there was a Babylonian general who deserted and joined Cyrus and the Persian army and kind of handed it over. This one historian says the fall of Babylon came quickly without hardly any battle going on at all.
Wow.
So Persia is now in charge. Cyrus is he's the guy. And one of the things he does for political and religious reasons, he sends people back to their homeland. And so the Israelites get to go back and to Jerusalem. And he wants them to build the temple. He wants to strengthen his kingdom. People are happy and they are indebted to him. So he does it for those political reasons, but he also wants all the gods to be praying for him, right? Yes. And so Israel has a god, and he wants them to be part of it. So 50,000 people return. All right. So now Now we're at Daniel. So, David, tell us how Daniel fits into that timeline.
Yeah, no, that's so good. So when Babylon was capturing the southern kingdom, so that the 500 some number that you mentioned, it came in waves. And so we read in the book of Daniel that the first wave of people that were basically captured and brought back to Babylon were the best of the best, the brightest, the most physically fit. And they were hoping to kind of bring this group. One, it destroys the infrastructure of the people that are left behind when the strongest and the most intelligent have been taken. But also, these are people that they're hoping to utilize for forced labor and beyond in Babylon. And so Daniel, along with some other guys you might know of, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are brought into Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar has this decree to kind of select the best of the best of the best, right? We want the brightest, those who have aptitude for learnings. And we are basically going to take them in under kind of the palace tutelage. We're going to train these young men to become the ideal Babylonians, right? And so they identified Daniel and his friends and some others as well. And so Daniel's young. I mean, Ron, I don't know if you have a number in your head, but in his teens, I think is a pretty safe bet, 14, 16, somewhere in there. So he's ripped from his home, right? Removed from the promised land. And yet we see beautifully played out in these first few chapters of the book of Daniel decide to live resolute in the midst of captivity. And so early on, he refuses to eat the king's meat because it was unclean or it violated what he believed the law said. And, he won't drink the fine wine because it was violated. And the guy who's kind of in charge of them is like, you're going to get me in trouble. And Daniel's like, just give it a chance. And so he proves out that in that touch of faithfulness, he ends up being blessed by being faithful to God. And then, of course, we have the Daniel in the lion's den story, which is much later in Daniel's life. Growing up, I kind of pictured him as like 20, and I think he's much more like 70 at that time, which is just amazing to think of. And the story of Daniel amazes me because he lived for decades as a high-ranking government official in a foreign land, while still being faithful to follow Yahweh. And that's why we focused on Daniel so much in our series that was about how do you live counterculturally, because I think it's such a great picture of you can help the people of the land you live in flourish. Christians should be a part of that process while also not compromising. And that's kind of Daniel's story where he won't compromise. Well, he's been in captivity for decades. And he's reading the scrolls of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah said that this captivity is going to last for 70 years. And Daniel's doing the math. And he's like, I've been here that long, or whatever the number is. He's like, that's like now. And so that's what we read happen in Daniel 9. We see this message come to him to say, yeah, they're going to come back with beyond that too. But Daniel basically spends his entire life in exile, sees this prophecy be fulfilled. And in Daniel 10, we see him basically 2 or 3 years after that return where those 50,000 Jews had gotten to come back. Daniel now is a man probably in his 80s, continuing to be a high-ranking official now in the Persian Empire, living in the capital city.
Well, pretty cool story all the way through Daniel's life, because we're going to talk about prayer from Daniel 10, but the lion's den story was you can't pray to any other God but our God. And Daniel says, watch this. Not only will I pray, but I'm going to pray and so you can see me. And you want to come and get me, come and get me. And God's going to protect me. We talked about, Israel at its height. We talked about the captivity. We've talked about the Babylonian Empire. Now we got the Persian Empire. And so many empires follow that. So let's just start there with kind of what we're going to talk about with prayer. David, talk about God's sovereignty. He's sovereign over all. The proverb, he takes the heart of the king and he moves it like a water channel, whichever way he wants it to go. And so parents out there are thinking, man, what, the culture's crazy, all this stuff going on. What is going on? And just remind them before we get into some of the practical things about prayer that God's got this. He's sovereign over all.
Oh, Ron, that's so true. And such a good reminder. And I think we are often very short-sighted and our memories are short. And you hear narratives of this is the worst it's ever been for my child, or it's the worst, what's happened. And maybe we have some people fond memories of what it was like when I grew up, and now is so much different. And I always just think, man, I wonder if someone living in Rome in like 64 AD with Nero on the throne, how they would respond to your comment. I just think it's amazing how we've seen the church endure great tribulations and trials. And yet in the midst of them, and that's the beauty of studying scripture, you see these long narrative arcs where all the while God is on the throne. And just like you said, Ron, I love that proverb that he directs the hearts of the kings, and he is sovereign. He is the one who is over all and in all. And a verse that I think we have, maybe many of us have memorized, and maybe sometimes, just kind of quote it, but it's so powerful that he truly does work together all things for good according to his purposes. And I think my favorite example of that, if you can let me, Ron, I've always loved this analogy. Ron, did you ever play chess growing up? Is that ever a thing you did?
Is checkers like chess?
Yeah, almost. Just like add another layer. I played chess a ton when I was little. I was really into it. I've since kind of fallen out of practice. It's been fun to teach my kids how to play chess, though. That's a fun exercise for my little kids. But I read a commentator who said, when it was in context of the story of Joseph, and at the end of his life, he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And he uses this analogy of, if I ever wanted to feel good about myself when I was little, I would turn the computer on and play chess against the computer on beginner, right? And I just would slaughter, you destroy them in like 20 moves. And then sometimes you'd slide the difficulty all the way to expert. And the end result was guaranteed. I was going to be defeated. But it's amazing. All the while, I have freedom to make all the moves I want to make. And this expert computer is able to instantaneously weave in my stupidity into his strategy, while also sometimes forcing me to only be able to move in one place. But the end result is guaranteed. That chess is the expert computer is going to win. And so the commentator made the point that in the scenario that we live in, and the Joseph story was the example he used, we're with God on that side of the chessboard, and the enemy is moving pieces. The enemy is trying, and all the while, the end result is guaranteed. And there's no move the enemy can make that God is not prepared for. And all the while, even when in the moment, a move might look, cause anxiety, or, oh my goodness, what are we going to do here? The Lord's plan is undefeated. And so I love that picture where God is moving those pieces around. Sometimes I don't see the long game, but the end result is guaranteed. He's going to work out together all things for our good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And that includes things at the level of nations and things going on in our day-to-day lives. He is in control of those things.
Yeah, it's a great illustration with the chess. And I was just thinking, so we're God's sovereign over all, right? Mm-hmm. And we're in it. We're living it day to day. He's working it all out for good. Cyrus has this good politics, right? Send the people back to their land and let's strengthen the kingdom. And God is the one over all that. So I think the beauty of God's sovereignty is, sure, I have to move the pieces, right? I've got the things going on in my life, and sometimes they're really, really challenging. Yeah. But that gives us such confidence to know that God's got this. Yeah. He's sovereign over this. He's going to work this out. He never wastes our time. So that's a great reminder for parents, right? In the midst of parenting, in the midst of challenges, every stage of parenting has its challenges. Yeah. And Laura and I were talking about that. When your kids are little, it's the physical challenge of the baby at night and the kids running around the house, and you're exhausted all the time. As they get older, it becomes the emotional energy that you spend. Not being able to make every decision for them, like sometimes we wish we could. Giving it over to the Lord and worrying sometimes, anxious, overwhelmed with what's going on in their lives. And so every stage has its challenge, but God is always sovereign. And so I just want to leave that with the parents, man. Whatever you're going through, trust the Lord, trust Him that He's going to take this thing. He's going to mold hearts. He's going to get people to the next step. And he's got a great plan. Got a great
Yeah,
plan.
Ron, a word that I have found myself wrestling with, just for to timestamp this when we're recording, my kids are 9, 7, and 5. So we're kind of coming out of that, waking up at 3 times a day phase of life. Don't quite yet have a teenager, although my 9-year-old is. That's kind of where she's heading. I can tell. I think a thing that, I don't know if this is a universal struggle or if it's just me, and you can let me know if you've had this experience. I think we all wish we were in control of our kids. I want to be able to figure out the right lever to pull to have the output be what I desire. And I have been continually reminded how little control I have over how my children respond. That doesn't mean I'm excused from trying to parent well, right? Of course, I'm moving those pieces, like you said. But I am so amazed at how much my efforts don't always lead to the results that I wish they had. But God's the one who's in control, right? He is the one. It's not me. And thank the Lord, because I don't know if I'd actually want everything I think I want. God's so much better. His plans are so much higher than mine.
Yeah, yeah. So here I have Daniel. 50,000 people go back to Jerusalem, to Judah, to rebuild the temple. It's a completely other story. But Daniel stays in the Persian kingdom.
Yeah.
Some possibilities. Maybe he's too old to travel, although he's going to take a 20-mile hike to go pray here in a little bit, so he can still do that. Maybe, as you mentioned, he says, I can be of more influence here in the kingdom. Now, I don't want to put anything into Scripture that's not in Scripture, but I like to let's just think about that last one. That Daniel makes a decision. I can be of more influence here than I can going and building, be part of the rebuilding team. And I say that because I was just talking to so respond to this. I was talking to a young father a couple days ago, and he was saying, we're at a stage where I'm God's really working on my heart. I'm trying to get involved. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do in ministry, and maybe I want to take a trip or whatever. And then, so we go through all that, but we kind of concluded God may have you do all those things. But your biggest job is at home. It's not the mission trip you take. It's not the ministry involved in. It's not when we teach up front. It's not the worship leaders or, again, whatever ministry you're involved in. Your greatest responsibility is right there. And maybe Daniel, maybe that was his decision, but we know our decision is I can do other things, but my influence has to be with my children. And so, I want you to talk about that. I think about guys, men and women, who pour into a career, and I can tell you, after it's over, you get, hey, thank you very much, done, right?
Yeah.
But man, your kids are always there. And if you want to leave a legacy, it's got to be in your home. So let's just say, we don't know for sure, but let's just say, Daniel said, I can have some more influence here. Talk about that a little bit regarding parents in the home with their kids.
Yeah, I'll give credit. John Mark Comer is an individual I listen to frequently, and he just shared on an interview I listened to him that we've interestingly kind of sold this language in our culture. I'll just stick to here to the U.S., where you're kind of told, at least as a man, that your late 30s, 40s, maybe up to your early 50s is your money-making years. That's when you probably have climbed the corporate ladder to a certain extent. You're still vital. You have creative thoughts and new energies, and you might be the top salesperson. And there's kind of this perception that, hey, you better make the money while it's there. This window's going to close. And it's so fascinating that for so many people that are in that phase of life, and this is what John Mark Comer said, is also around the same time that most people have teenagers at home. And the research is clear. moms tend to have the loudest and most important voice when kids are young, little. They tend to be inclined towards the mom. But then as kids grow older and get into those preteen, teenage years, for whatever reason, the research has shown us that the father's voice seems to have even more weight to it. And yet so many men, that's when they go, I got to make that money. This is the time to build the empire, to leave, ironically, a legacy for my kids. And so often you might have built this nest egg, so to speak, or, now I have this inheritance to hand down to my children. And I wonder how many of those teenagers who now at that point are in their 30s or 40s would say, I would have traded all of that for just more time with you. And so, that's kind of in the secular language of, building business. But Ron, you and I are both in ministry, and a phrase that we try to say at I try to remind myself often is I'm not going to sacrifice my family on the altar of ministry. I don't think God's inconsistent where he would ask me to fail in one area that I know he's called me to succeed in another area that I believe he's calling me to. And so I just feel, again, God, you said this earlier in the interview, God never wastes our time. Those moments where I'm with my children from a production standpoint, right? Writing stuff or producing stuff or answering emails may feel less productive, but oh my goodness, it's not a waste. Those moments of even just sitting side by side, whether that's in silence or in conversation or playing, is sowing seeds that I think will reap a bountiful harvest, because that's what the Lord's called me to do. One of my first responsibilities is to care for my wife and to care for my children. And it's a job only I can do. No one else. I can't farm that job out to anybody.
It goes fast. Everybody says that. Everybody told us that. And we said, yeah, we know. And I got to tell you, it goes really fast.
Did it go fast? It went fast.
And you're saying, yeah, I know. Every generation says that. God's sovereign. Daniel decides to stay for whatever reason. They're in the Persian Empire, mm-hmm. And in Daniel 10, he's already had this prayer interaction in chapter 9, mm-hmm. But in Daniel 10, he has another interaction with God, a vision of this great war coming, mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about the spiritual battle going on. And before we get there, let's talk a little bit about that regarding parenting, because I think we all agree there's a great war going on for the souls of our kids.
Absolutely.
The cultural issues. And again, I'm with you. If someone says this is as bad as it's been, I say, well, let's just go back to Judges. Let's read a couple stories there. But it is. It's an yes. anti-God culture.
Yes.
The rise of nuns, more and more people saying we have no religion. No, we're not anything. Technology, devices that kids use in technology, not only are they taking a lot of time and can be kind of mind-dumbing time, but man, there's a philosophy being shot through, that technology. Discipline, the whole aspect. I was talking to a young family the other day and said, hey, I'm thinking about doing something on parenting. What topic? And they said, discipline of a preteen. And I thought, well, okay. There's a lot to that. I get it. They're in the throes of that. Satan's out to get our kids, right? So there's a great war going on. And you say that prayer is the greatest weapon in spiritual warfare. Talk about that, and then support that from Daniel 10.
Yeah. So Ron, that's so good to highlight. While I do recognize historically the church has been through difficult times, I don't want to minimize the challenges that we're facing here in the U.S. I mean, I think we are moving into, if not already, a post-Christian culture, and you see it manifested. And oh my goodness, the things you just listed that our children are having to grow up in the midst of. I mean, I don't know about you, Ron. I got my first cell phone that had internet connection when I was in college. And my first thought was, thank God that I did not have this when I was an eighth grader. I mean, I don't even know how I could have navigated such at my fingertips, that connectivity. And so I just think that now it's kids when they're 5 or 6, have access to those kind of things. And so clearly there are things that our kids are going to deal with that, as you said, it's not just wasting a lot of time. I think it's discipling people. It's causing them to think about things in certain ways. It's the things that the church is meant to be doing, and they're getting it from sources outside of the church, and of course the family first and foremost. So all that to say, I love that you mentioned at the end of that summary of all the things that are going on that the devil is after our kids. And so what I want to mention there is the scriptures are clear. So often we can get this wrong idea of who the enemy is. And the enemy is that friend in my kid's classroom who's a bad example. They're the enemy. Or my kid's phone is the enemy. Whatever it might be, or that type of book, or this group of friends that they're involved with. And we can begin to think of them as the thing that's threatening my children. But the scriptures are clear that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but we wrestle against these cosmic forces, these principalities and powers. And the enemy is not what we see necessarily right in front of us with our eyes. But as we'll talk about, there's something going on behind the curtain, right? There are forces at work in this world that, while are hard to kind of put our finger on, the scripture is clear that there are things happening in the spiritual realm, so to speak. And so my point there of saying prayer is the greatest weapon we have. So often we try to solve spiritual problems with physical solutions, or you might say spiritual problems with worldly solutions. It goes back to what I just said when it comes to wanting to control my kids. I just want to read the right book with the right parenting strategy so I can pull the right levers to make my kids be who I want them to be. If I have the right bedtime, I make sure they have the right, kind of app blocked on their phone. And I'm trying to pull this. And there's nothing wrong with trying to parent well. Of course, that's our responsibility. But so often the issue is a spiritual one. And so in the midst of trying to pull all those levers, we can forget that the greatest way we can attack a spiritual problem is with a spiritual solution, right? And so I think that's what the scriptures challenge us then is, well, what are our resources in a spiritual battle? I think it's prayer. And I think I can point to Daniel as kind of an example of how when he had this terrifying vision that caused him great anxiousness and fear, his response was not to run to King Cyrus and say, can we put a plan in place? Let's get a battle plan, or let's get some wise counselors. His solution is, I need to pray about this. And I don't know if you want to talk about what that prayer looks like, or if we can go through that together.
Yeah, I want to do that. I want to emphasize one thing you said, because I think it's so important. We can't control our children to begin with. Right?
I'm going to keep trying, though, even after this interview.
I'm still trying, and my kids are older, and it's not working. I promise you it doesn't work, right? No. So we can't control our kids, but we want to do things that fix the problem. And during this series of podcasts, we're gonna look at some things. We're gonna look at some things regarding technology. How do you guard against some things? So those are practical things. We need to do those. A quick story. I got a good friend, and he said, my kids, my girls. He has 4 girls. My girls are not having a smartphone. They're just not having one. This was a few years back, and so. They didn't have one. All their kids had one. They were like saying, we're the last kids on the planet without a phone, please. And he said, no, we're not going to do it. So he said one day he had his phone, and his phone messed up. He couldn't figure out what to do with it. And his daughter, who didn't have a phone, took his phone. And then she was like manipulating it and moving it all around, and it fixed it. And he said, time out. What happened? How did you learn that? Oh, the kid on the bus, right? So unless you're going to keep your kid in a cocoon, right, they're going to be out there. The other thing too is we could, and we will, again, I have a podcast on technology, but in 5 years, who knows what that technology is going to be like? Yeah. So it's so critical that we get back to the basics. We don't know what our kids are going to be facing in their lives, right? But we do know that God's sovereign, that He's in control, and we need to pray, and that is the greatest weapon against spiritual warfare. Okay, so Daniel's praying, and in chapter 10, and you talk about place that he prays, the posture, and persistence. Like a good teacher, you have the three P's. Did it take you a long time to get that, or did that like pop out?
Another one of my, a pastor on our team had two of them. And so we all brainstormed the third. And I was like, there it is, 3 P's.
2/3 of this is his. All right. Okay.
Getting back to the basics, right? Yeah.
All right. So prayer is the greatest weapon in spiritual warfare. Let's talk about the place.
Yeah.
Why is talk about Daniel and where he went, and let's talk about why that's important.
Yeah. And so I want to give the caveat. I know that some listening to this have very small children. They're in the phase of kids waking up at midnight. So I'll get to that caveat in just a second. But when we see Daniel have this vision, and we don't know necessarily, the scripture isn't perfectly clear on which happened first, whether he had this vision as he was in this location, or he had the vision and then went to this location. But the vision he has in Daniel 10 is along the banks of the Tigris River, which doesn't necessarily mean a lot unless we recognize that Daniel lived in still the capital of what was Babylon, now Persia. Well, the Tigris River, which is a very long river, its closest point to the city Daniel would have been living in is 20 miles. And so we just see this picture that Daniel, whether it was he had the vision and thought, I need to go be away from the hustle and bustle, or perhaps he was thinking about the Jews who had returned and was praying for them. You know, things weren't going smooth for them back in Jerusalem as they were trying to build the temple. We just see that Daniel chose to withdraw, which again, just when you look at Daniel's whole arc of his life, we see him praying very publicly out the window of his house. But in this instance, we see him withdrawing to a distant place to seemingly give, we're going to find, extended, uninterrupted time in prayer. And so Daniel seems to recognize this is one of those moments where I need to withdraw. And if I can kind of speak to this time frame, again, the Bible isn't saying if you don't go far away and pray all by yourself, God doesn't hear your prayer. That's certainly not the case. So, you know, for those of you that have littles, you're not going to take a 4-day retreat with a 6-month-old at home, right? I mean, that's challenging, and I totally get that. And that's why I love Nehemiah, such a great example of prayer. Nehemiah's prayers are all like one sentence long, and it's right before he's about to say something to the king. And so I think God hears both of those prayers. But I think what this is saying in Daniel's example here is that when it comes to spiritual warfare, sometimes we need to withdraw from all of those sensory inputs of our hustle and bustle, our day-to-day, you know, our inboxes, right? Those things, and say, in this moment, I'm going to kind of separate myself from those things to just be able to go all in on my knees, to begin to engage in this battle that maybe is so often kind of missed or behind the scenes, so to speak, in my normal everyday life. And so we see him kind of retreat, which of course, Ron, I'm sure you've seen this when you read the Gospels. It's a pattern that Jesus himself did. In the book of Mark, we see that Jesus would often go off to lonely places and pray. And we also see examples where he prays in front of huge crowds. So this isn't it's only this way. But I think it's a question for us to ask. When's the last time that we intentionally withdrew from our usual rhythms, from our usual, you know, inputs and busyness to say, I'm going to go to a place where I can focus on this battle, this spiritual battle that I'm in with the greatest weapon I have of prayer. So
great point. So Daniel goes off. He gets away from the hub of the empire, the distractions that go with that, and he finds a quiet spot to pray. Okay, now let's circle back to that mom who's saying, "Yeah, you two guys, that's great. What a great principle. I can't get like 3 minutes away from my kid." And I do the nap time, and that is, you know, then I got to catch up on everything else. So let's talk to moms and dads. There are some practical things, right, that we can do as fathers. We're to love our husbands, or to love your wives as Christ loved the church. And one of those things may be, hey, I'm coming home earlier, or I'm going to work it out in my schedule where I give you some free time, and part of that free time can be getting away with the Lord. Same with wives with husbands. So there's some, just drill it down on a base level. There's some practical things we can do,
Absolutely.
even in the busyness of life, to make sure we have that time with the Lord.
No, that's so good. And I know that's not everyone's situation, but when you have a partnership of a spouse, that's something we got to lean on each other to say, hey, this is going to be a time where maybe I'm going to get up early so you can have that time alone, and vice versa. And that's kind of been the answer for me. I do think there's a time and a place for a far more extended and kind of a retreat idea. And that's something that needs to obviously be planned. But for me, it was just this question of I could sleep another 20 minutes or I can get up. And there are days where I went, I do not want to get up. I mean, my wife will tell you funny stories of found me asleep on the closet floor, right? I mean, I was like, I meant to get up. I couldn't make it quite, but
Can only get so far.
I know. I was like, but at least I was out of bed, but for a phrase that my wife, Natalie, uses all the time that I think is so helpful is if you're in that season, a phrase she uses all the time is just do something. And an example of that would be, you want to start a workout regimen. And so you want to have this awesome workout of like, I work out 6 days a week and I do this type of workout and this type of workout, but that seems too unattainable. And so often then we do nothing. And so Natalie's kind of motto that she said at our house all the time is, well, just do something. So it might be, well, I wish I could get away for a weekend of prayer and solitude. Well, if that's not doable in the moment, and that's, again, maybe something worth working on or having that conversation, do something. What can you do today to build in this pattern or rhythm of going to the Lord in prayer? And it might be starting with 5 minutes. And if that's what you have as a next step for you, take that next step. But don't let ideal get in the way of progress, right? We're on it's a long journey, a long obedience in the same direction, right? That's what the Christian faith is.
Praying for your children, that is the most important thing a parent can do. So Daniel, this hero in the Old Testament, teaches us how important prayer is and how to pray for those we truly love. I pray today's episode has been helpful. Be sure to join us next time as we continue the conversation with David Colonna.